So first off, we remember these GPS coordinates that were plotted for us, remember? Those GPS coordinates were taken from Wyatt's boat and they were plugged into Google Earth and they developed a PowerPoint slide that we saw there that mapped out all of the points. So I decided to overlay those Google points on top of the points of the research that I'd already been doing. I discovered some interesting stuff because if they were just overlaying it on Google Earth, it should have been easy as cake, right? Well, I cannot tell you how many hours I spent trying to perfectly overlay this. Like, look at the islands in the middle here. I get them lined up and then other things won't match up. Like you'll notice, like I said, these islands, look, they aren't moving, but everything else around it isn't working. So right away, my instincts are telling me that somebody manipulated this image to cover something up. Of course, that is alleged. I can't prove that, but you know, it's supposed to just overlay. So honestly, I just did the best I could, and I mostly just focused on the top half, trying to get like the marina and the grandparents' house they went to all line up. So now we can really follow which way this boat was driving and the kind of stops it seemed to be making. And if you'll notice here, it goes right next to that marina that I was telling you guys about with the Marty McGrath, which is who, according to Katie, that she got a ride from. So they passed the marina, and as you can see, it juts out almost like it was pulling up to this dock. And then there's these two houses here, especially this house, where it seems like the boat pulled into the docks there. Then it went all the way down here. There's a little like lock area here, so you have to go through here. And it went to the bridge. And I was like, why did they go all the way to the bridge to turn around? But it turns out right here is a big old fishing pier. And then right next to that is the Ocean Springs Yacht Club. And a lot of these families are connected to the yacht club. But before I go on, I want to play a portion of this audio that's supposedly like a voicemail that has been going around. It hasn't been authenticated, but it has important information. Because I'll be honest, it sounds genuine to me and it works with my data. So hold on.
But he was like, oh, I'm just going to go back with Katie. We'll be right behind y'all. We were all going to the same house, the same place. He was like, I'll be right behind y'all. Y'all go ahead without me. I'll see y'all. Like, I'm literally going to be right behind y'all, whatever. So, Wyatt and all them left because they were like, okay, he's gonna go with Katie, whatever. Well, then everybody got back in and we were all at Ava's house and...
Some nights change a family forever, and this is one of those nights. Christine Wansley remembers exactly where she was standing when her son said goodbye to her for the last time. She remembers what he said, how he said it, and how it felt to hold him one final time without knowing it was the last time. Welcome to Pioneer's Diary. Here you get daily true crime updates. Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, said the last time she heard from him was July 3rd. He had cooked dinner for his parents that evening, the kind of ordinary family moment that no one ever thinks to memorize until it becomes the last one. Then he left to stay at a friend's house for the night. Before he walked out the door, he turned to his mother and said, "Hey, Mom, I'm about to go. I love you." He gave her a kiss and a hug before walking out into the summer night. That was the last time she held her son. And now, more than a month later...
So first off, all of us were going to go to the same place. I'm going to go in with Katie, meaning Katie was supposed to be at that party with them. Or at least whoever Katie was with was supposed to be at that party, right? But that's not the important part. The important part is the name of the person who was throwing the party was Ava. Now, I found Ava. I'm not going to put her name out there, but simple Google searches will find this information. And I was able to basically just Google her name and find her address. And so the party was actually right in this yellow area. Again, I'm not going to be like pointing out people's houses, but I found it. After they leave this pier that's right next to the yacht club, they go all the way back and then they hook around and they go right next to where the party is. And then that's when they finally go and take the boat out of the water. Now, it seems to me like they were dropping people off, like, because look how it goes in a little bit, almost like it was pulling into this pier at the marina, like I suspected. And they were just making the rounds, dropping people off before the party. Now, her family and Wyatt's family, Warren's family, they're all connected. They're also part of the yacht club stuff. All of these rich families are super close, super connected. They're taking each other's kids on vacations, etc. Well, like just in May, there was a joint birthday party. In the background of this birthday party from the beginning of May, there's Warren's mom, There's his little brother, and right there in the background is the mayor of Ocean Springs, Bobby Cox. In fact, here's another picture of him from the party, just in case that profile view wasn't enough for you. Oh, and he was tagged in the picture. Oh, and remember Lieutenant Carone, the first person on the report that we see when Nolan's mom called him missing? Well, as it turns out, someone that he's related to, I can't pinpoint exactly how the relation is, but their maiden name is the same as his last name. Yeah, turns out they have the same last name as who? The girl whose party it was. And I have confirmed that that woman is mutual friends of the mother of the girl who threw the party. And I'm gonna go ahead and just wild guess theory, this is alleged, but I'm gonna go ahead and guess that the reason they waited so long to tell the mom was they were waiting to make sure that he was on shift. And this is why I'm thinking more and more that they brought Nolan back to the house. Everybody got their stories straight and stuff, and then they waited to tell Nolan's mom until he was going to be on his shift and taking that phone call. Which is probably why nobody was sent out to look for him that fucking night. That's why we don't have any footage of them going back to the grandparents' house up there. That's why no pictures from this supposed party ever came out.
A grand jury in Mississippi wants to know exactly what happened between that goodbye on the evening of July 3rd and the moment Nolan Wells stepped onto a boat headed for Horn Island the following morning. This is no longer just a drowning investigation. This has become the story of a family being handed one version of events while the physical and digital evidence appears to be telling them something else entirely. So, let's slow down and talk about what has actually changed since this case first made headlines. Because the story most people heard in the beginning was simple, almost tragically ordinary. Nolan Wells, 18 years old, was found dead on July 6th. 2 days after he was last seen with a group of friends who had taken a boating trip out to Horn Island to celebrate the 4th of July. His friends returned from the island that day without him, but they came back carrying his phone. Nolan's friends told police that he had chosen to stay behind on the island to talk to a girl. That was the explanation. That was the story that circulated first, the one that made its way into early news reports, and the one that, for a few days, seemed to satisfy investigators.
I figured it out. I figured out the Nolan Wells timeline. I know how they mess with the GPS. I figured it all out. I figured out the lies that are based in truth. I figured it all out, and I've got proof. But stick with me because it's going to be a long video, y'all. Now, I found a 15-page Marine Patrol report that had lots of little details that prove that the boys had been lying. So I've already shown how at 1:30 in the morning, the initial Lieutenant Odom with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office said that his deputies spoke with several of the friends who traveled to the island on the vessel with Nolan. And they said that he left in the company of an unknown female and that he chose to remain on the island.
So what was the next step? Did you guys ever engage with police or?
Yeah, so the first time I talked to police was July 7th. I talked to the lead investigator, and I told him my whole story, top to bottom. Dot every I, crossed every T. I told him everything I knew, every little detail.
Well, that's a lie now, isn't it, Warren? Because you talked to them at 1:30 in the morning that night. I mean, did you just forget to tell the cops about Katie? Because it's not like you didn't know it was her, or you didn't know how to get in contact with her.
The girl that he was with, Katie, had texted somebody that she heard people yelling.
Correct.
Nolan yelling.
Yeah, and I have a picture of that. She texted my buddy, and the next day everybody was panicking. Everybody was texting Katie, because she was obviously seen with Nolan the whole day at the island. Katie sent a message to my buddy the next day and said, this is the last time I saw him, he's really sweet. But she also mentioned that the last time she saw Nolan was when my buddy was yelling at him to get on the boat.
But Katie says that she assumed that she went on the boat after y'all were yelling at him. And let's not forget that the last time you saw him was 3.
Well, the last time I saw Nolan was 3 o'clock. And Nolan was cradling a girl in his arms.
And yet for some reason around noon, the name of another girl who hadn't even seen Nolan in a year was given to the patrol to go interview, saying that she was with that group, not Katie. They also gave the name of a couple of other friends who they weren't able to get in contact with. And despite having a picture of a text message from Katie, funny how you didn't share that with Officer Tatum. Probably could have cleared up some stuff real quick, right? Now let's get to the data. Now, at about 1:30 on July 5th, they were doing a flight of drones based on the relation of the last known anchor position of the Atkinson vessel, which I have documented right here. 4:30, Officer Strickland contacted Jennifer Pyrone, who was Wyatt's mother, who told them that he had already spoken to officers earlier in that day, but they were happy to cooperate with any investigation. And she let this officer take a picture of the GPS. Officer Strickland observed the track line showing Pyrone's vessel location on Horn Island. then gave coordinates. I'm going to need you to remember this exact phrasing. It's going to be important later on. Now, this was the GPS coordinates from the picture that the officer took, meaning that these coordinates had to be a different one that was verbally given over the phone by Wyatt. And you'll notice they're quite different. Now you'll notice that this incident report says the involved entities are Bart Edmington and Jerry Adkerson, not Wyatt. Even though Wyatt is 18, he should be on this report. And you could argue that they were just giving the names of the people that owned the boats, but somehow I doubt that 21-year-old Bart owns that boat. You'll notice on this report that 2 different pieces of GPS evidence were collected. So now we're going to go to the July 8th report where they came and they took those GPS coordinates from both the Adkerson boat and Bart's boat. Yellow is Bart, blue is the grandfather Jerry. You know, the same Jerry that called and canceled the sea tow as the sea tow phone call was being made. Now, mind you, this is 3 days after the police had come and spoken to the mother and gotten the GPS coordinates. Now, Bart had a germane GPS map chart plotter. Jerry's boat also contained a germane GPS map chart plotter. Now, I had to look up the difference between waypoints, tracks, and routes. So waypoints mark specific spots. Routes connect them in a planned order, and tracks record your actual path. Now, according to that GPS data, there is no movement from 11 to 4:30, but we know that that's not true. Warren has never been able to logically explain how they ended up so far away from the shore. Because according to him, he said at 3 o'clock, that was the last time he saw Nolan, Bart was trying to yell at him to get on the boat. His brother got into a fight, so he got his brother to come over there. That's when he saw that it was all sinking, because he said this.
There's a lot of people on, so it drags water in, and eventually, I think over time we were out there for a couple hours, the boat just started filling up with water. So I popped the starboard side hatch, and the battery was completely underwater.
Yes, but according to Warren, he had just seen Nolan, like neck deep, cradling a girl at the boat next to them. So how did they end up in 31 feet of water at the 4 o'clock call? There's an hour in between that. If the battery is submerged, how would they even get away from the sandbar? You can see in the background of this picture, they are far away from people. And yet this GPS is saying that you were stationary the whole time. But why? Especially because we have actual fucking proof right here. We have the coordinates that Wyatt's mom gave them the second time, and the cop took a picture of the GPS. Compare it to the GPS coordinates in which they were trying to get a tow from. But what if I were to tell you that not only does a waypoint need to be physically saved on this exact type of GPS, you have to intentionally say, mark this spot, or else it doesn't automatically save. It records your tracks automatically, but those are just saved coordinates. And it turns out you can actually delete tracks. It's super easy. You just go into the main menu and you delete it off of your data. So why is this GPS data, which is right here, so much further away than what the GPS says it is later? There is no data included in that GPS report that explains them going from here to here, unless someone went in and deleted those tracks. Because they probably dropped that waypoint once they anchored, which would explain why Warren said they showed up at 10:30 and the GPS says that they showed up after 11. And so then it wasn't until half an hour after the canceled tow that they dropped another waypoint. And mind you, the exact same GPS was used in both boats, and Wyatt/Jerry's boat has the tracks and routes where Bart's does not. And again, it tracks it automatically. So you have to intentionally delete those tracks. And why did they do that? Well, it turns out Jerry Atkinson just so happens to be the owner of Ocean Marine Group in Ocean Springs and Gulfport, which is literally a boat dealer. So guess who's gonna know that information? We already know Grandpa Jerry was in the mix, because the only way that he could have canceled the sea tow before it even started to head out is if Wyatt had called Jerry first and Jerry told him to call for a sea tow and then canceled it for him. which would explain why he couldn't give any descriptions of where the water was. How high was it? We know that the sea tow did not bring in the boat. In fact, Bart's mother came on Facebook and said that there are pictures from my son's boat of the boat about to be towed, which is clearly who is about ready to tow them here, as Wyatt is on the phone. I can tell you 100% that this is not a sinking boat. You can see Bart bringing them in this picture. But Bart was supposedly the one yelling at Nolan to get on the boat, remember? Why would he be yelling at Nolan to get on a boat that's sinking? Unless he was telling Nolan to get on his boat. And Warren accidentally explained what really happened with the engine. Whatever happened with Nolan happened on Bart's boat, allegedly, which is why all of Bart's information was deleted. So here's what happened. Both this one and this one confirmed that there was a fight that broke out on the beach. Started out with him, ended up with Warren's little brother. His uncle says, we gotta go. They hop on a boat and they leave. He grabs his drunk younger brother and says, we're getting out of here too. 3 o'clock. This whole caravan is trying to get the hell out of there because they're drunk and fighting. Wyatt's boat was in such a hurry that they couldn't figure out how to put the freaking trim down, which caused the motor to overheat, quickly stranded them, and Bart had to come help them. The time that Bart shows up, something has happened between him and Nolan. They're all distracted trying to fix the bilge pump because it didn't trim down. The waves were crashing over the boat and into the bilge pump, short-circuiting it. During this, some people have figured out that Nolan is gone. Other people just think that he's passed out or something, which is why Wyatt calls his grandfather to figure out what the F to do. And as the phone call is being made, more people are figuring out something's wrong with Nolan. That's why they didn't start moving again for 30 minutes. They were coming up with a plan and figuring out how to make it work. I've run out of time, but don't worry, I'm doing a follow-up to this video with more details, more information. And if you like my work, be sure to show your support in my bio.
4 days, Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter maintained publicly that no foul play was suspected in Nolan's death. But Nolan's family did not accept that explanation at face value. They began asking questions. They began digging. And what they started uncovering is exactly why we are here today, more than a month after the tragedy first broke, still trying to make sense of a case that keeps getting more complicated instead of less. The results of the Nolan Wells death investigation will now be presented to a grand jury once the investigation is complete. According to the family's attorney, Ben Crump, once the Jackson County Sheriff's Office finishes its investigation into Nolan's death, the district attorney's office will formally present the case to that grand jury. On paper, that is standard procedure for most unnatural or suspicious deaths in Jackson County. It is not, by itself, an indication of wrongdoing by anyone. Standard procedure. Hold on to that phrase for a moment, because you're going to hear it again in this video, and it matters every time it comes up. Because what isn't standard is a grand jury subpoenaing security camera footage from a family member's private home. What isn't standard is issuing formal subpoenas to 5 different major social media and technology companies. And what definitely isn't standard is the existence of a 30-minute window during which an 18-year-old's movements cannot be verified by a single other human being, on a night when he was supposed to be safely with friends. Here's the question we're left with today, and it is not the question most people online are asking. Everyone wants to know what happened on Horn Island. That's understandable. It matters, and it should matter. But the question investigators appear to actually be pursuing right now, based on the subpoenas they've issued, is a different one. What happened to Nolan Wells before he ever got on that boat? And did anyone around him that night already know that something was wrong, long before anyone called for help on the water? That is the question this investigation seems to be circling. And right now, the only thing that might help answer it could be sitting quietly on a hard drive, inside a set of home security cameras belonging to someone's grandparents. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, this channel covers active investigations using primary sources, court documents, family statements, attorney press conferences, and official records. We don't speculate for the sake of engagement. We follow the evidence, wherever it leads, and when the evidence contains a gap, we tell you it's a gap instead of pretending we know how to fill it. That's it. That's the whole approach. No shortcuts, no manufactured drama, just the documented record laid out as clearly as we can lay it out. Now, let's talk about what we actually know, and just as importantly, what we still don't know, because in a case like this, the gaps are often more revealing than the facts. On July 3rd, Nolan left home and went to stay with friends ahead of the planned Horn Island trip the next morning. Then at 9:56 a.m. on July 4th, GPS tracking shows the boat carrying Nolan left the mainland, headed out toward the island. So between the moment he hugged his mother goodbye on the evening of July 3rd and 9:56 the following morning, Nolan was with friends, out of his parents' direct sight, in a stretch of time that has come to be known as the overnight window. And that overnight window is exactly where the grandparents' security cameras come into the picture. Because if Nolan stayed at a friend's house that night, and that friend's grandparents happened to have working security cameras on the property, those cameras may have captured a great deal. Who came and went? What time Nolan actually arrived? Whether he left the house at any point during the night? Whether anyone else showed up who wasn't supposed to be there? And whether there was, somewhere inside that window, a period of roughly 30 minutes during which something doesn't line up with what has been publicly described. Now, I want to be very clear about something because it's easy to read too much into a subpoena. The existence of a subpoena does not tell us what investigators found. It only tells us what they are looking for. And right now, based on what has been made public, they are examining that overnight window very closely. That, on its own, tells you something important about where this investigation has shifted. It is no longer just about the island. It is no longer just about the water. It has expanded backward in time, into the hours before Nolan Wells ever set foot on a boat. Let's move forward and reconstruct the day itself, using what has actually been documented. Around 11 a.m. on July 4th, Traston Shepard was already out at Horn Island with part of the group. Nolan called him for help finding a good place to anchor the boat once it arrived. By 11:14 a.m., Nolan's boat had reached the island. Traston says he then spent much of the day with Nolan and the larger group of friends who had all made the trip out for the holiday. During the early afternoon, by all accounts, Nolan was doing what any 18-year-old on a 4th of July boat trip would be doing. He was swimming. He was socializing. He was photographed among the boats, present, visible, seemingly enjoying himself with the group. Around 3 p.m., Warren Hudson later said that was approximately the last time he personally remembered seeing Nolan. At that point, Nolan was reportedly interacting with a girl named Katie, which lines up, at least in part, with the early explanation that he had stayed behind to talk to someone. And then, this is where the timeline begins to fracture in a way that has drawn the attention of investigators, journalists, and the family alike. Newly obtained GPS data adds another layer to this timeline, and it's a layer that complicates the simple story considerably. That data shows the boat that had originally brought Nolan to the island did not actually leave until around 4:30 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after a dispatch call had already reported that the boat was taking on water. Think about what that means for a moment, because it's easy to skim past a detail like this. A newly released recording captures a frantic call placed from the boat involved in the Nolan Wells investigation. The call was made by a teenager on the boat at Horn Island on July 4th, around 4 p.m., to a private towing company called Cito. In the call, the teenager can be heard saying, "Hey, we're at the west tip of Horn and our bilge pump stopped working." So, around 4 p.m., someone on that boat contacted Cito because the bilge pump had failed. The boat was actively taking on water. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was an emergency call for marine assistance. And then, around 4:30 p.m., roughly 30 minutes after that emergency call, that same boat left the island anyway, with everyone on board except Nolan. At least publicly, no witnesses have come forward to say they saw Nolan Wells after 4:30 p.m. on July 4th. Not one person. Think about that in context. This was an island full of people celebrating the 4th of July. Music playing. Boats everywhere. People constantly coming and going between vessels and the shoreline. And yet, in all of that activity, on one of the busiest days of the summer for a place like Horn Island, no one has publicly stepped forward to say they saw Nolan Wells after his friend's boat departed. Does that sound, to you, like someone who simply and calmly chose to stay behind on his own? Investigators have specifically requested original, unedited photos and videos taken on July 4th, particularly, according to the language used, those depicting alleged altercations or containing images of, or believed to include, Nolan Wells. Notice the specificity there. They didn't simply ask the public and the group of friends for photos of Nolan enjoying the day. They specifically referenced alleged altercations. Authorities say they are also investigating online reports of an alleged altercation on the island on July 4th and whether Nolan was involved in it in any way. In one video recorded near the island and widely circulated on social media afterward, someone can be heard yelling as if they were involved in a heated argument. One of Wells' friends later publicly stated that the voice heard in that video was his own voice, not Nolan's. In the video, you can hear someone yelling, "That is me." Traston Shepard told Rolling Stone that it was, in fact, his voice on the recording. Okay, so a friend has stepped forward and confirmed that he was the person yelling. That is a fair and reasonable clarification for him to offer. But the underlying questions haven't gone away just because one voice has been identified. What was the argument actually about? Who was he arguing with? And, critically, where was Nolan Wells when it happened? Now let's turn to the phone, because this is where the family's suspicions first began to take real shape, and where the story stopped feeling like a simple accident to them. When Wells' parents got his phone back from the friends who brought it home, they reportedly noticed something troubling. Content that had been posted to some of the teenagers' social media accounts on July 4th appeared to be missing from Nolan's device entirely. His mother described this directly during a press conference. "When we made it home, my sister and I actually went through Nolan's cell phone, particularly Snapchat, because that is so popular with the children. When we opened it up, there was nothing. There were no saved pictures. There were no snaps from that day. And we did open it before the 24-hour expiration." Let that sit for a moment. An 18-year-old on a 4th of July boating trip with a large group of friends, and his phone contained nothing from that day. No snaps. No saved photos. Nothing at all. Christine Wansley has been explicit that there were no saved pictures and no snaps from that day, despite the fact, as she has stated, that Nolan was known among his family and friends for regularly taking pictures. This is not internet speculation. This is his mother, on the record, describing her son's documented habits and then describing what she found, or rather, didn't find, on his phone. And when she got that phone back, the very same phone his friends had physically brought back from the boat to the truck, it appeared, in her account, to have been wiped clean of that day's content. One of the friends pushed back against that characterization, stating, "No one even was in contact with his phone until it was moved from the boat to the truck, and none of us have access to Nolan's password to get on his phone and delete anything." So here is the contradiction laid out plainly. The friends say they never touched the phone and had no access to it. The mother says the phone, when she examined it, had been effectively wiped of that day's content. Those two claims cannot both be fully true in the way they're currently framed, and that contradiction is exactly why the subpoenas became such a central part of this investigation. Christine Wansley's legal team issued subpoenas to several major social media and technology companies in an effort to obtain records connected to her son's accounts, amid mounting questions surrounding the 18-year-old's death. The court documents were filed in the Mississippi State Chancery Court and sought information from Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Snapchat, TikTok, and Life 360. The subpoenas seek messages, photos, and videos sent and received through Wells' accounts, along with GPS data, location information, and timestamps tied to those accounts. The court orders command the companies to provide subscriber information, communication history, direct messages, photos, videos, and GPS location data connected to Wells' phone number and email address. Everything. They are asking these companies for everything they have. And here is why that matters so much to this case. If Nolan did take photos or send messages on July 4th, some of that information may still exist on the servers of these social media companies, even if it was deleted or removed from the physical device itself. Even if someone manually deleted content from Nolan's phone, certain platforms retain metadata such as IP addresses, timestamps, or location-related information tied to that activity. The subpoenas also specifically request IP addresses associated with activity on the accounts, along with information that could identify, or help identify, the people who communicated with those accounts around the time in question. They seek posts, stories, chats, messages, direct messages, photos, video recordings, text files, GPS data, friend list history, and other stored records the platforms may still be holding. Think about the mechanics of that for a moment, because this is really the heart of the digital side of this case. If someone deleted Nolan's Snapchat content from his phone, and the subpoenas eventually come back showing that the content existed on a company's server at a specific time, and that it was accessed or removed from a particular IP address, investigators could potentially establish far more than the simple fact that something disappeared. They could potentially determine when that activity occurred, and, depending on the data available, where it originated from. That is not speculation on our part. That is standard digital forensics, and it's precisely why these subpoenas were filed the way they were. Each of the 5 companies has 21 days to respond to the court order. As of this recording, that clock is actively ticking. Now, let's bring in something that a lot of the coverage on this case has not focused on nearly enough: the independent autopsy. Because the findings from that examination are genuinely complicated, and complicated may honestly be the most accurate single word to describe them. The independent autopsy, commissioned by the family, found an unexplained area of red discoloration near the back of the teenager's skull. However, and this is important, the examination did not determine what caused his death, and it did not determine whether another person played any role in it. Dr. Roger A. Mitchell Jr., a board-certified forensic pathologist and the former chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C., released his findings publicly at the 117th National Convention in Chicago. Mitchell classified both the cause and the manner of Wells' death as undetermined, pending further investigation. His findings neither prove that Wells was assaulted, nor do they establish that his death was a straightforward accidental drowning. It is, quite literally, an open question from a medical standpoint. So, the independent autopsy cannot determine exactly what caused his death. But it also cannot conclude that this was simply, cleanly, an accident. It sits in the space between those two possibilities. And here is the detail that makes the picture even more complicated. The board-certified pathologist found red discoloration in the soft tissue in the back of Wells' head, but there were no underlying skull fractures and no lacerations to the skin surrounding that area. Red discoloration on the back of the head. No fracture. No laceration. On its own, that combination of findings could point in several different directions. Decomposition can cause discoloration like this. So can blunt force trauma that does not result in a broken bone. The decomposition of the body itself, combined with other limiting factors in the examination, made it impossible for the pathologist to reach a definitive determination one way or the other. Without additional information, the pathologist wrote that he could not rule out whether any intervening non-accidental factors contributed to or caused Nolan Wells' death. Read that again, because the phrasing matters. He could not rule out non-accidental factors. That is careful, deliberate, clinical language. It doesn't accuse anyone of anything, but it also refuses to close the door on the possibility. The forensic pathologist said he did not know what condition Nolan Wells was in before entering the water. He did not know whether Nolan was conscious or unconscious at the moment he entered the water. He said that distinction alone would be medically and legally significant. He also said he could not determine whether Nolan entered the water voluntarily or whether he was forced into it. Again, he stated plainly that this distinction would be significant. So, Nolan Wells' physical and mental condition in the moments before he entered the water may well be the central issue of this entire case. Determining whether he was conscious or unconscious, and whether he entered the water willingly or was forced, could be absolutely critical to establishing both the cause and the manner of his death. That is not a minor footnote buried in a medical report. That is potentially the entire case, resting on a handful of physiological facts nobody has yet been able to confirm. And right now, nobody can answer that question with any real certainty. In the autopsy report presented by Ben Crump, Dr. Mitchell noted that parts of Wells' throat were not present when his remains were received for the independent examination. Because of that missing tissue, the pathologist said he could not rule out an injury to the neck as a contributing factor, or even a possible cause of death. Crump has stated that portions of the anterior neck structures were missing by the time the independent team examined the remains. The preliminary report notes that during the initial autopsy performed in Mississippi, part of the throat had already been removed. Now, to be fair to the process, Doctors say it is not unusual for pathologists to remove organs or tissue during a standard autopsy so that they can examine deeper structures more closely. This happens in ordinary cases all the time and is not, by itself, evidence of anything improper. So the honest question becomes, was that tissue removed strictly as part of standard autopsy procedure, or does its absence create a genuine problem for the independent examination that followed? That depends heavily on the specific circumstances, on chain of custody documentation, and on records that have not yet been made public. And that is exactly the kind of technical, evidentiary question a grand jury may ultimately have to weigh. Dr. Michelle Duray has noted that the autopsy findings, taken as a whole, were equivocal, pointing specifically to the red discoloration around the back of Wells' head, the absence of fractures or deep tissue injuries, and the advanced decomposition of the remains by the time of examination. Equivocal, not conclusive in either direction. The evidence, as it currently stands, doesn't clear anyone of wrongdoing, and it doesn't establish wrongdoing either. It remains, frustratingly, unresolved. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department's own autopsy and toxicology results have still not been made public as of this recording. That is a critical, load-bearing fact in this entire story. The state's own official findings have not been released to the public or, as far as we know, to the family in full. The family's independent autopsy has provided some information, some partial clarity. But the complete state autopsy, the toxicology results, and the official cause of death from the state of Mississippi have not yet been made public. And until those reports are released, everything we currently know about the medical side of this case remains incomplete by definition. But here is what we do know, and it matters a great deal. A newly completed independent analytical review of photographs, videos, GPS coordinates, and witness accounts concluded that the available evidence still leaves a material gap in the timeline, specifically, a gap between Wells' last independently corroborated sighting and the reported departure of the boat that had originally transported him to the island. A material gap. Those are the exact words used in a 22-page independent report. The report is careful to emphasize that it reaches no conclusion regarding criminal or civil responsibility. It does not name a suspect. It does not allege a crime. Instead, it identifies specific pieces of evidence that investigators may still need to examine in order to resolve the many unanswered questions in this case. So even this independent analytical review isn't pointing fingers at anyone. It's pointing at gaps, and it's saying, in fairly clinical, restrained language, that those gaps need to be filled before anyone can confidently explain what actually happened to Nolan Wells. Now, let's separate the questions because there are really two distinct issues running through this case, and they are frequently being mixed together in public conversation in a way that muddies the analysis. Question 1. What happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island during the afternoon and early evening of July 4th? Question 2. What happened to Nolan Wells' phone and his broader digital footprint in the window between July 4th and the moment that phone was physically returned to his family? Whether Nolan drowned accidentally is one question, rooted in physical evidence, tides, and forensic pathology. Whether someone altered or removed digital evidence afterward is an entirely separate question, rooted in metadata, timestamps, and account activity. And right now, only one of those two questions has documented, tangible evidence directly connected to it in the public record: the phone, the missing Snapchat content, and the subpoenas that followed. That is where the paper trail currently exists in its clearest form. And that brings us back around to the GrandParent's security cameras. Because if the grand jury is examining that overnight window from the evening of July 3rd into the morning of July 4th, they may not be focused solely on what happened out on the island later that day. They may be trying to determine what happened before anyone ever got anywhere near the water. Now I want to bring in something that genuinely changes the way we should be looking at this entire investigation. Up to this point, much of the public conversation, the comment sections, the online theories, the short-form video takes, has focused almost entirely on what happened on the island itself. The party, the boat leaving, Nolan allegedly staying behind, his remains being recovered 2 days later. But the grand jury subpoena for the GrandParent's security camera footage suggests something meaningfully different is happening behind the scenes. It indicates that investigators aren't only looking at Horn Island anymore. They're also, quite deliberately, examining the night before anyone even left for the water. And here's why that matters from a forensic and investigative perspective. Ben Crump has said that forensic audio specialists are actively reviewing the complete, unredacted CETO emergency call from July 4th. At the same time, ocean engineering experts are examining exactly how Wells' remains ultimately came to be recovered near the northwestern tip of Horn Island. Crump put it this way: "We want to know how is that possible with the oceanic tides. You've got low tides and high tides, so something isn't adding up." Think about what that statement actually means. The family's legal team is not simply asking where Nolan was at any given moment. They are asking how his remains ended up specifically where they were found, and whether the documented tidal and current patterns for that stretch of water actually support the version of events that has been presented so far. Now let's talk about the enhanced audio, because this quickly became one of the most debated and, frankly, one of the most misunderstood pieces of evidence in the entire case. The original recording, released by Mississippi Marine authorities, captured a caller requesting assistance after reporting that the boat was taking on water and possibly at risk of sinking. Straightforward on its face, a distress call. But a newer version of that same recording, reportedly enhanced by an independent audio engineer, appeared to contain someone saying in the background, "Is he dead?" along with someone saying Nolan's name and telling someone to wake up. That version spread rapidly across social media. It became the headline. It became, for a period of time, the single most shared piece of evidence in this entire case. But here is exactly where we need to slow down, because this is where careful, sourced analysis matters more than virality. Digital forensics expert Robert Fried has said he could not corroborate the claims, widely attributed to TMZ, that phrases such as, "Is he dead?" could actually be heard in an enhanced version of the distress call connected to the Nolan Wells investigation. He reached that conclusion after directly comparing the enhanced version against the original recording, side by side. Notice this detail because it's important. Fried said the version circulating with the TMZ attribution is approximately 20 seconds longer than the original recording, and it carries a different digital fingerprint entirely. So we now have two versions of what is supposedly the same piece of audio. One is 20 seconds longer than the other and shows a different digital fingerprint under forensic examination. And a credentialed forensic expert has stated on the record that he cannot independently verify the sensational claims about what can supposedly be heard in the background of that clip. While the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources did release the original audio, Fried has said that much of the file appears to have been redacted, potentially leaving out information contained within the true original file. His stated position was direct: "I want to see the original and I want to look at the metadata of the original." So even the expert who has actually examined this recording in detail is essentially saying, "I need the raw file. I need the metadata. I need access to what has not yet been publicly released." And that sentiment, the need for more raw, unredacted material, has become a recurring pattern throughout this entire case. Every time someone appears to get closer to a real answer, another unanswered question seems to surface right behind it. Now, I want to pause here and do something important, because this case has generated an enormous amount of emotion online, and understandably so. An 18-year-old is dead. His family has real, legitimate questions. The public has questions. And the answers have been coming slowly, far too slowly, for many people watching this unfold. But emotion without evidence doesn't actually help Nolan. And speculation without reliable sourcing doesn't help his family get closer to the truth. So let's look specifically at where the expert forensic analysis currently stands. Not the social media theories. Not the Reddit threads. Not the TikTok reenactments. The actual, documented forensic picture as it exists right now. Dr. Kendall Von Crowns, the chief medical examiner in Tarrant County, Texas, who has no direct involvement in the Wells case, has explained publicly that the red discoloration observed could represent decomposition-related changes in the muscle tissue. It could also potentially result from blunt force trauma to the back of the head or neck. A third possibility, according to Von Crowns, is lividity, the natural pooling of blood after death caused by gravity. Dr. Victor Whedon, a forensic sciences professor at George Washington University, has also discussed lividity as a plausible explanation. He has noted that the specific position of the body at the time it was recovered could help determine which of these explanations is more medically likely. So there are, at minimum, 3 distinct and medically legitimate possible explanations for the exact same physical finding: decomposition, blunt force trauma, or ordinary post-mortem lividity. And determining which explanation actually applies here could depend on a detail as specific as the precise position Nolan's body was in when it was pulled from the water. That is the kind of granular detail that the state's complete, currently unreleased report may ultimately be able to clarify. The state medical examiner's autopsy report, which was the first of the 2 examinations conducted, chronologically, is now complete. However, its results have still not been made public as of this recording. And until they are released, the independent pathologist's conclusion of undetermined remains the single most medically responsible conclusion currently available to the public. Dr. Mitchell has said that one of the most significant limitations he faced was the inability to directly examine the airway and lungs for evidence of water, as well as the inability to directly examine the stomach for gastric contents. Think about that limitation for a moment, because it's genuinely significant. One of the central diagnostic questions in any suspected drowning case is whether there is clear physical evidence of water in the lungs. But the independent pathologist could not perform that specific examination because the lungs had already been examined and handled during the earlier state autopsy. The tissue had already been processed. Drowning is widely considered one of the most difficult diagnoses in all of forensic pathology, precisely because there is no single autopsy finding that can definitively and independently prove it occurred. Let that sink in for a second. Even under ideal, controlled circumstances, determining conclusively whether someone drowned can be extraordinarily challenging for even the most experienced forensic pathologist. Now factor in advanced decomposition. Factor in a second, independent autopsy performed days after the first one. Factor in missing anterior neck structures. And you begin to understand exactly why both the cause and the manner of death remain formally classified as undetermined. This is not necessarily evidence of a cover-up by the independent examiner, and it would be irresponsible to frame it that way. It is, in large part, simply science running directly into the hard limitations of the available evidence. But here's the important part. Those limitations are not purely medical in nature. They are also directly connected to information that has not yet been made public by the state. The state examiner may well have access to witness statements, preserved physical evidence, the original examination materials from the first autopsy, and other investigative records that were simply never made available to the independent examiner. Those additional materials could potentially help clarify the cause and manner of death far more definitively than what is currently public. According to forensic pathologists not directly involved in the Wells case, the overall process, subpoena responses, forensic review, state report release, grand jury presentation, could realistically take months. That is the word being used by professionals who understand exactly how long these processes typically take. And Nolan's family may have to wait through that entire process without knowing, with any real certainty, exactly how their son died. Now, earlier in this video, I said there are 2 distinct questions running through this case. What happened to Nolan on the island, and what happened to his digital footprint afterward? But there is actually a third question that has been growing steadily louder as this investigation has progressed. And it connects directly back to the GrandParent's security cameras. What was Nolan's condition before he ever got on that boat in the first place? Because if the overnight period from July 3rd into the morning of July 4th is now genuinely under investigative scrutiny, and investigators are subpoenaing home security footage from that exact window, then the scope of this investigation may extend far beyond simply what happened on Horn Island. If investigators are requesting home surveillance footage from that precise window, then they are not simply filling in the timeline for the sake of thoroughness or procedural completeness. They appear to be looking for something specific. Whether Nolan was injured, whether there was some kind of confrontation, whether someone arrived or left the property during those 30 minutes that, as of now, no one has been able to publicly account for. I don't know what those cameras show. You don't know what those cameras show. And until those recordings are formally reviewed and officially entered into the investigative record, no one outside of that investigation knows either. But the simple fact that a grand jury issued a subpoena specifically for that footage tells you that investigators consider it potentially significant to the outcome of this case. And that brings us to a development that occurred just days ago, one that many people covering this case in real time haven't fully processed yet. Two of Nolan Wells' friends returned to the island where the 18-year-old went missing. Their attorneys said Warren Hudson and Jax Pattillo, who are believed to have been with Wells on July 4th, the day he disappeared, traveled to the island on a Friday afternoon to examine the layout of the area and better understand the circumstances surrounding it. Their attorneys, identified as Edward Andrew Peltzik and J. Tyler Cox, confirmed the visit in statements to CNN. Now, ask yourself something honestly. Does that development sound like panic, or does it sound like a coordinated plan? I'm not going to answer that question for you. I'm asking you to genuinely sit with it, because I do not know their actual intentions, and neither does anyone watching this video. Their attorneys have publicly stated that their clients want to find the truth. Attorneys for the friends have said that Wells' companions had nothing to do with his death and wanted to personally understand what actually happened out there. Fair enough. That is their official statement, and they are absolutely entitled to make it publicly. But the optics of physically returning to the scene, accompanied by attorneys and, reportedly, a photographer, more than a month after your friend's remains were found there, while an active grand jury investigation is underway, can look very different depending on where you happen to be standing when you view it. To be clear and fair about where things currently stand, none of the friends has been charged with anything. No one has been charged with anything at all in connection with Nolan's death, as of this recording. What these friends have actually done, based on the public record, is retain legal counsel, issue public statements through that counsel, and now return to the island with that legal counsel physically present. That is not, in itself, evidence of guilt. It is evidence that people connected to this case understand they are under active scrutiny and are responding accordingly. And there is something else happening around the periphery of this investigation that needs to be openly acknowledged, because it is directly affecting the environment surrounding the entire case. On August 4th, an Illinois man was arrested and accused of threatening witnesses connected to the Wells investigation. All three individuals involved in these threat cases face charges of making interstate threatening communications. 3 separate arrests. People located in different states, all facing federal charges tied directly to threats connected to this single case. Federal prosecutors have also charged Joseph Alfredo Vasquez de Mars of Sacramento, California, with allegedly sending violent online threats directed at Jackson County Chancery Judge Ashley Cole. Her stepson, Warren Hudson, was among the friends who accompanied Wells to Horn Island on July 4th. A sitting judge receiving credible, prosecutable threats, connected specifically to the fact that her stepson happened to be on that boat. Think about what that reality does to the environment surrounding an active investigation like this one. Think about what it could mean for other witnesses who might otherwise be willing to come forward with information but are now watching what's happening to people already connected to the case. And think honestly about what all of this does to a community that is genuinely trying to determine the truth about what happened to a local teenager. Judge Cole later responded publicly, stating that although the threats against her had become increasingly serious, they would not stop her family's efforts to help determine what happened to Wells. We also want to know what happened to Nolan. We will do everything within our power to assist Nolan's family in their quest for answers, she wrote. That is the stepmother of one of Nolan's friends publicly saying, in effect, we want the truth here too, regardless of what it costs us personally. And that is the part of this case that doesn't fit neatly into a dramatic headline or a 30-second clip. The people closest to Nolan, including several of his own friends and their families, are also publicly saying they want the truth to come out. Meanwhile, people sending threats from behind keyboards in other states entirely are actively making it more difficult for everyone involved to actually get there. Mississippi Public Safety Commissioner Sean Tindell also issued a public warning that a purported toxicology report circulating widely on social media was entirely fraudulent. The purported toxicology report from Nolan Wells circulating through social media on various outlets is fraudulent, Tindell wrote in his statement. He added that Nolan's family, his friends, and Most importantly, in his words, Nolan himself deserved better than fabricated documents circulating in his name. Fake documents, death threats, multiple arrests. And still, as of this recording, no official cause of death has been publicly released. That is the environment in which this grand jury investigation is currently taking place, and it's worth sitting with that context before jumping to conclusions from any single piece of viral content. Now let's talk about what the family has actually explicitly said they want, because they have stated it publicly, repeatedly, and with remarkable consistency. Crump has dismissed the prospect of competing civil lawsuits as a distraction from the real goal, while Wells' mother, Christine Wansley, has said she intends to keep pushing for answers regardless of how long the process takes. "I am asking for answers. That is it. That is all," she said in a recent social media video. That is it. That is all. Not a demand for a conviction before any trial has occurred. Not a demand for a predetermined verdict before the evidence has even been fully reviewed. Just answers. Crump has said that he and the Wells family want a thorough, complete investigation into the teenager's death, nothing more and nothing less than that. "We know that in America, in the South, certain people are investigated differently," Crump said. And that statement captures the undercurrent running through this entire case, whether or not you personally agree with the framing. It raises the question of whether Nolan Wells' death is being investigated with the same level of urgency and scrutiny that would be applied if the circumstances surrounding it were reversed. If the only black teenager on a boat full of white friends had safely come home, and one of the white friends had instead been found dead on the island 2 days later, would the public still be waiting this long for basic autopsy results? Would the sheriff still have publicly said no foul play was suspected during that very first week? Would over 30 days have passed before a grand jury finally subpoenaed home security camera footage? Those are genuinely uncomfortable questions to sit with. But they are also questions this family has been living with, privately and publicly, every single day since July 6th. The Congressional Black Caucus is now amplifying the family's public calls for an independent, fully transparent investigation. In a formal statement, the caucus said, "Too many questions remain unanswered. The Wells family, the Mississippi community, and the American people deserve a full, transparent, independent, and timely investigation." At Nolan's funeral, held in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, the sheer weight of what this family has endured was impossible to miss for anyone in attendance. Many mourners came dressed in black and blue, the official colors of Wells' high school football team, specifically at the family's request. Black and blue. His team's colors. That is what an entire community chose to wear to say goodbye to an 18-year-old who, under any other circumstances, should have been getting ready for his next football season. Reverend Al Sharpton, who delivered the eulogy at the service, told the gathered mourners, "We want to celebrate Nolan and, at the same time, say we want a full and thorough investigation." As Wells' parents joined Crump on stage during the service, he led the mourners in a chant, repeating, "Nolan's life matters." Crump then added, "Until we get answers, until we get to the truth, until we get to justice, we're going to stand up and we're going to keep ringing the justice bells for Nolan Wells." And, notably, the community has not stopped since that funeral. Dozens of people gathered at Jones Park in Gulfport for a community press conference and a justice walk honoring Nolan Xavier Wells, with organizers publicly calling for a more transparent investigation into his death. Supporters marched down Highway 90 and across the Coast Transit Authority pedestrian bridge, chanting Wells' name throughout the march, working deliberately to keep his case visible in the public spotlight rather than letting it quietly fade from the news cycle. Hundreds of miles away from the Mississippi Gulf Coast, members of the New Orleans community independently gathered for a second-line procession specifically to honor Wells and to call for justice on his behalf. Organizer Reuben Evans said the event was intended not only to celebrate Wells' life, but also to remind his family, from a distance, that they were not alone in this fight for answers. A second-line procession in New Orleans, for an 18-year-old from Ocean Springs who most of those marching had likely never personally met. That detail alone tells you something meaningful about what this case has become in the public consciousness. It is not local anymore. In truth, it arguably never was purely local to begin with. Organizer Selena Charles put it simply, Having questions is not violence. She continued, "You know, it's not a case of we want to scramble at each other and fight. We have the question in mind. What happened to Nolan Wells? Having questions is not violence." It's worth remembering that line, especially in the weeks ahead. Because there is a difference between asking difficult questions and pretending that we already know the answers. There is a difference between demanding accountability and demanding a conclusion before the evidence has been fully examined. And there is a difference between keeping attention on a case and allowing speculation to become a substitute for facts. Right now, this case remains in that uncomfortable space between what we know, what we don't know, and what investigators are still trying to determine. As the grand jury continues reviewing the evidence, as subpoena responses begin arriving from the technology companies, as the forensic audio continues to undergo independent examination, and as the state autopsy is eventually, presumably, made public, there will be more information coming. Some of that information may answer questions. Some of it may create even more questions. And some of it could potentially change the direction of this entire investigation. That is exactly why the evidence has to come first. Not social media momentum. Not coordinated threats. Not anonymous posts. Not screenshots without context. Not rumors repeated so many times that people eventually start treating them like established facts. And certainly not baseless speculation dressed up as insider knowledge. Evidence. That is the standard this case deserves. And more importantly, that is the standard Nolan Wells family deserves. So let me lay this out one more time, as clearly and plainly as possible, because after everything we've discussed, it is important to understand exactly where this case currently stands from a legal standpoint, based entirely on the public record available as of this recording. The autopsy findings, along with the other results of the ongoing investigation, will be formally presented to a grand jury. That grand jury will then determine whether the evidence supports the possibility that Nolan's death resulted from a crime. But there is an important distinction here. The fact that a grand jury has been convened does not, by itself, establish that a crime occurred. It does not mean that someone has been found responsible. It does not mean investigators have already reached a final conclusion. And it does not mean criminal charges are inevitable. The district attorney's office has been explicit about that. Convening a grand jury is a procedural step that can be used in cases involving unnatural or suspicious deaths, and its existence should not automatically be interpreted as confirmation of criminal activity. That distinction matters. Because when a case becomes emotionally charged, procedural developments can quickly be turned into conclusions that the available evidence simply does not support. As of now, no one has been charged in connection with Nolan Wells' death. No one has been publicly identified by authorities as a formal suspect. The state autopsy has been completed, but its findings have not yet been released publicly. The independent autopsy lists both the cause and the manner of death as undetermined, pending additional information from the state's own examination. That means there are still unanswered forensic questions. And those questions matter. Attorney Eric Hers has also said that discussions are continuing regarding a joint forensic examination of the cell phones connected to this case. That examination could potentially include the FBI if those discussions move forward as planned. Think about what that could mean. Digital evidence can potentially help investigators reconstruct timelines. Messages, calls, location information, photographs, communications between people. Records that could help establish where someone was, when they were there, and who they were communicating with. But the important word is potentially. Until those examinations are completed and their findings become available, we don't know what they will reveal. They could confirm existing accounts. They could contradict parts of the timeline. They could provide information investigators were not previously aware of. Or they could ultimately answer very little. That uncertainty is precisely why the examination matters. Not because we already know what it will show, but because we don't. The district attorney has described Wells' case as a genuine priority and has told local media that findings from law enforcement will be forwarded directly to a grand jury to determine whether formal charges are ultimately warranted. And that brings us to the other major investigative threads. The technology companies named in the subpoenas have 21 days to respond under the terms of the court order. The grandparents' home security footage has been formally subpoenaed. The forensic audio is still undergoing independent review by outside experts. And the ocean current and tidal analysis connected to where Wells' remains were recovered remains actively underway. These are several completely different investigative paths. Digital evidence, video evidence, audio evidence, forensic evidence, environmental evidence. Each one approaches the same basic question from a different direction. What happened to Nolan Wells? And more importantly, what happened during the hours before his disappearance and in the circumstances surrounding his death? Every one of those investigative threads remains active as of this recording. None has been fully resolved. And that is one of the most important things to remember when discussing this case. This is not a completed investigation waiting for a final paragraph. This is an active investigation with major unanswered questions. Each individual piece of evidence could potentially change the direction of the case depending on what it ultimately reveals.